So there's a Buddhist term, emptiness, that doesn't really have an equivalent term in the West, not in Western religions, not really in Western psychology. So it's subject to misinterpretation. It can sound scary, right? Emptiness, it can be interpreted as, void of existence, dark nothingness, total absence, right? Sort of a nihilistic interpretation of what emptiness actually means. You know, in Buddhism, the term nirvana, is often translated as cessation. So these words can, give pause to a spiritual seeker, sort of wondering whether, that's really a good idea to go down that road towards, if that practice, that tradition leads to emptiness, and we take emptiness to be an absence of, of everything, then the conclusion can easily be, well, I'm not so sure I want to do that. I'm good with the practice, but not with emptiness taken to be extinction, right? But what does this emptiness actually mean? We can say, I have a glass of water and I pour the water out, and now the glass is empty, right? And it's empty of water, but we wouldn't say that the interior of the glass is non-existent. I mean, it clearly still exists. It's full of air and, it's contained within the glass. So it's empty in one sense, but not empty in maybe a more ultimate sense. So if we begin to look at the subtleties of what this emptiness means with sort of an open perspective, it's very revealing, and it is, I would say, instrumental in understanding what unity is, what unitive consciousness is. And the connection may not be at all immediately obvious. So we'll take a little time and sort of walk through this Buddhist concept of emptiness. So the first question might be, empty of what, right? And the way the term is used in Buddhism is empty of separate self, empty of the more technical term is intrinsic origination. In other words, a separate existence apart from, everything else. Right? So if we take ourselves to be separate, separate from, the rest of existence, life, creation, then we're claiming some separate sense of self, separate origination, not dependent on everything else, just separate, divided by, my skin. This side is me, everything, that side is, everything else. But when we look more closely, even though this is what is typically assumed to be true, that I'm separate and then there's all those other people over there and nature and etc., plants and animals, and but I'm here, that is a belief that we've taken on board during this lifetime. So the question is, once we've taken on that belief as being true, and we get into spirituality, and we think, one of the desirable goals that I've heard about is this sense of being one with all existence. but I feel separate. Right? So then the question arises, well, how being separate, how can I divest myself of this sense of separation? And this is where ideas of, getting rid of the ego, killing the ego, ejecting the ego comes in. But in order to divest ourselves of this sense of separation, we have to first believe that it's true, right? If it can be seen that it's not actually true, then we don't have to try to get rid of it. We don't have to, once we've recognized something as to be an illusion, we don't have to try real hard to get rid of it. We just see, well, it's not actually true. End of story, right? Not as a belief, but just really, as a result of thorough investigation of what's actually going on. So let's walk through that, because the Buddhists have been, in typical Buddhist fashion, have been very methodical in terms of looking at all aspects of what we take this sense of separate self to be. And it's easier if we start with inanimate objects. And then we can talk about humans. So let's use an example as a car. Let's just say a black Mercedes, right? So as soon as you say a Mercedes, then there's a certain image that's conjured up. The image isn't being generated by the car, right? The image and association with what a Mercedes is held in our own head, a result of advertising and culture and finances and all of that. And so we hold an image of what that car is. The other thing that we can see is that, Mercedes is a brand. It's not any particular car is not identical with any other particular car. I mean, there's different models, there's different colors. Even if it's black on the outside, it may have different interiors, different upgrades, etc. So they're not quite the same. They have different mileages, different years. They've been treated differently by their owners, etc. So there's this time component where it's been exposed to the impermanence of life, and that has changes. So we're not talking, even the term Mercedes, although it sounds specific, it sounds like we're talking about the same thing, but we're not. We're every car is different and is a function of their own particular life experience, etc. The other thing that we can notice is that we can never take in the entirety of the object in one go. If we're looking at the left side, we're not seeing the other side. If we're looking at the hood of the car, we're not seeing the engine, etc. Also, if any association that we have with it, maybe we have a high car payment, or maybe we have a repair bill coming up, so we have a different relationship to it. So we would see that vehicle in a different way. Somebody else would see it that wasn't, say, the owner of it. So we're not looking at the same vehicle. We can also see that the vehicle is composed of parts that aren't in themselves a Mercedes. That, at some point they were assembled, and, they weren't Mercedes, but at some point this concept called a particular vehicle comes into being for some period of time, its useful lifespan before it's begins to fall apart and becomes part of a junk pile. But it does have a lifespan during which it's always changing. So when exactly did it come into being as a separate definable object. At first there were parts. At first, before the parts, there was engineering plans and materials in far off places that got sent and compiled. And so we can see that there's no specific beginning of various life span, that we're seeing it through our own conditioning. And so even though it appears on a conventional level when we're talking to somebody, we can talk about a black Mercedes of a certain year, and the other person, if they're familiar with those particular cars, would understand what we're talking about. But on a deeper level, we can see that there's no particular beginning, there's no particular end. Every relationship between a person and that object is going to be unique. And so we can see it as, it's just sort of loosens our perception of what appears to be distinguishable external objects. We can see that that's more like a concept than a reality. That the reality is that it's always in a state of flux. The concept black Mercedes isn't ever completely true. It's true in a conventional sense, but not in a deeper sense of what created basically the causes and the conditions that led this vehicle to come into being for a short period of time. So it's sort of this evolution of and result of effort of many people and countries and corporations and materials and knowledge, etc., to create for a short time this form that is not permanent and will eventually dissipate over time. So we can perhaps see that fairly clearly when we sort of slow down and pick apart the pieces of what appears to be sort of a fixed external object that we can name, and that name gives it a certain fixed quality. Right? So the reason that I've taken some time to go through it with an external, sort of very conventional object is that same kind of sort of picking apart the details is applicable to what we take ourselves to be. And what nearly everyone takes themselves to be is this separate body-mind, right? This form. We're talking about the Mercedes, now we're talking about the human body. So we take ourselves to be this, and yet when we start looking at it more closely, we can see that it's also the temporary formation of many, many causes and conditions that allowed it to come into being, that it is always changing, always in a state of flux. And just on a very, ordinary way of looking at it, we can see that we're dependent on the air that we breathe, the food that we put in our mouth, the farmers that grew the food, the sun that warms the earth enough for the food to grow, the rain patterns, the soil conditions, the plants that died to feed the soil to grow the plants. And all of that is necessary for the continuation of this form. We all know this, but we still take ourselves to be, that's just, outside inputs. It's not really what I am. But we can apply the same sort of looking closely at it when we, let's say, look at our ability to perceive. So we know we have these organs of perception, our eyes and ears and ability to taste and touch, etc. But our eyes in themselves don't possess a sense of personal self. Right? You know, the eyes, if you know, if we're listening to music, the eyes don't get jealous. Right? It's not like, well, what about me? You know, I'm pretty important too. You know, there's not the sense of personal identity in these sense organs themselves. In the mind, there may be, right? But in the body's ability to sense and pass on this information, it's not in that capacity of perception. That sense of self, if it resides anywhere, it's in the mind, deciding what we take ourselves to be, right? So that way, if we lose our sense of hearing, it's not that we lose our sense of self, right? There's that remains, even though that capacity of perception is lost. Right? But we might say, okay, well, this sense of identity, this self certainty about who I am, this sort of rigid, separate self, is what I think. You know, my memories, my hopes, my dreams, my storyline, my regrets, all of that mental package. That's what I am. But when we look back, we can see that there's, you know, large spans of time when we don't remember anything, and then we'll have a memory here, you know, a few video clips from past years, but most of the time we have no recollection of it all. So if it's this intermittent memory, is that really something solid enough to park our identity in? Is that really where this sense of self resides, in the storyline that I can't quite even remember most of it? I'm not talking about just old age, by the way. I'm talking, you know, we may remember less than younger people, but still, even, you know, if we try to think about, you know, actually remember, you know, brushing our teeth last Tuesday, we don't. I mean, we knew that we did, but that's, you know, an assumption of our habits and memories, but it's our actual memory of that specific event is not present. So when we see that these mental formations, these thoughts are always changing, our ideas, our hopes, our ambitions, our fears, everything is always in a state of flux. We can't really say, well, that's a firm and fixed and invariable, separate sense of self apart from everything else, because it's dependent on what happens. I mean, if something tragic happens or something wonderful happens, there is has an effect on how this body feels about it. So we're not disconnected from what's happening in our environment. And, you know, and we also know that these bodies change over time. They certainly age every day. I don't know, 1 million or so cells die and are replaced. And yet there's this sense of continuity, you know. So the sense of continuity is what gives rise to this sense of separate personal self, because there is that sense. But when we actually look at the functioning of the body, we see it's dependent on everything around us. It's dependent on our parents, you know, giving birth to us, and their ancestors, and the sun and the moon and the stars to create this planet, etc. So we are dependent on all of that, and yet there's this sense of being a separate self-entity. And so this is what this inquiry into emptiness really questions. Because the sense of continuity is there, we just attribute it to this body. But when we look at this body, it's always in transition, always changing. Perceptions, feelings, thoughts, memories, always in a state of flux. Body physically always in a state of flux. So this impermanence is not just at the moment of death. It's really a continuous thing through life, always changing, always impermanent. And yet this sense of continuity gives rise to this, well, there must be something here, something separate, something identifiable that's me. But when we go looking for this separate sense of self, one of the things that is puzzling is that we don't find it. It's like when Ramana asks, ask yourself, who am I? And we sit down with, all the intentions in the world to think, okay, I'm gonna discover this, spiritual self. I'm certain of it. And we look. There's nothing there, right? There's memories. There's ideas about who we think we might be. But, if we can see that those memories, thoughts, beliefs, ideas, metaphysical beliefs, etc., are empty of reality, empty of this sense of self, then where does this sense of self arise from? Because there is a sense of self. Right? So what we discover that this emptiness is that it's empty of a personal, separate self. We discover that that's not actually true. But what we do discover is that there is still this sense of self, very intimate, just not personal. It's just this sense of, for the lack of better words, it's just this sense of spacious, aware presence, knowingness, beingness, within which we experience life through and as this appearance of this body-mind. So we discover that this body-mind is empty of personal self, but what we do discover is that there is a much deeper sense of self, the one self experiencing life through and as all this immense diversity of form. So that's where the unity part comes in, recognizing that what is living this life is already the one unity, the one source. We don't have to attain it. We just have to see that what convinces us otherwise is our belief in separation. Without the belief in separation, unity is overwhelmingly obvious as our natural state, not as an elevated high state. Feels good, yes, but it would be more aptly described as our natural state. Natural state prior to all of the ideas and beliefs that we've taken on in this lifetime. So that's the possibility of recognizing the sense of unity through the exploration of emptiness, of what this form is manifested as, and from all the causes and conditions, the temporary nature of it, the ephemeral sense of moment to moment life unfolding in all the mysterious ways that it does, and recognize that there's no personal self parked in that experience. Where it is parked is in the knowing presence of whatever's being experienced. So there was a very well-known, in Buddhist circles, well-known 3rd century Karnira Buddhist philosopher called Nagarjuna. And he said, without emptiness, nothing makes sense. With emptiness, everything makes sense. So by really delving into this concept of emptiness brings us to an understanding of unity. But the concept of emptiness is also empty. It's not like a divine dogma to be worshipped, right? It's a understanding, it's a perception, it's a tool, it's a way of looking at our existence that can be helpful in recognizing unity. But it's not in itself, not in itself a permanent truth. Nothing spoken can be absolutely true, but it can be very useful in pointing us to what is true, and that is the essence of our own existence.